Hey attendees, my name is Patrick Kiley-Rendon. I'm currently the Director of Instructional Technology in the Long Beach School District. When I started my program at St. John's University, I was an assistant principal of a high school, and prior to that, I was a high school English teacher. Um, Even when I was an English teacher, I always had a really strong passion for educational technology. I've been a big nerd my entire life, which all of that has kind of led me to the role that I'm in now, but also led me to pursuing the doctoral dissertation study that I did, looking at makerspaces and their academic outcomes on students. Um, I graduated the program in 2019, and my first symposium was back in 2017. And probably the greatest part about attending that symposium was the Q&A after each presentation. And I'm sorry that you guys don't have that opportunity. It was a great way to learn from people who had recently defended and hear what their struggles were and kind of just learn from their process. So my presentation today, I will be taking you through my defense presentation, but I'll try to put as much of those little moments in there as possible so that you can learn from what I went through, and especially from some of the struggles that I encountered. Let me share. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about makerspaces, and I knew that as a student, I would have loved to have a makerspace in my school. And I just wanted to find out if they actually do have any academic outcomes for students. So I used middle childhood students, and we'll talk about my sample size and some of the some of the struggles that came with that in a little bit. But over the last few years, STEM education has gotten a focus in public education that hadn't been seen since the Cold War. And even Barack Obama, when he was president back in 2015, said science is more than a school subject or the periodic table or the properties of waves. It's an approach to the world, a critical way to understand and explore and engage with the world, and then have the capacity to change that world. And that's really the goal of makerspaces. It's not just to learn facts in isolation. It's to apply skills and knowledge and inquiry, and hopefully take that when you move on past schools. At the time, there were no quantitative studies that evaluated the effects of makerspaces on academic achievement. There were a few quantitative studies that focused on the types of equipment that was out there in different makerspaces, the patronage, the staffing, but nothing really on the academic achievements. And that's because it was really something that's difficult to measure and quantify. It just seemed like there was a major gap in the literature, and I was hoping to address some of that. As far as the theoretical framework, Vygotsky is probably the most influential on my study. That zone of proximal development, students expanding just beyond their knowledge, their current knowledge, and then also working with more knowledgeable others. And that was very important in both my discussions with staff members and also in my findings. But constructionism, the theory of cognitive development, the theory of creativity, all obviously very important in makerspaces. Makerspaces address the NGSS and the ISTE standards, but whether or not they support achievement in science, technology, math, critical thinking, problem solving, none of that is really obvious or easily measurable. And there's also not much conversation about the long-lasting effects that maker experiences have on students when it comes to long-term making, problem solving, tinkering, etc., inquiry. And although it's a widespread phenomenon, these are popping up, hundreds each year in the 2010s. There were no best practices determined. Just really quickly, talking about widespread phenomenon, a great tool was looking at Google Trends and using Makerspace, making STEM labs, STEAM labs as search terms, and just watching the graphs to see when these started to take off. And that, depending on your topic, that might be something that you decide you want to use. even if it's not necessarily something that's really useful in your paper, it might be something that helps you identify certain trends or cycles or patterns. So I had my research questions. Um, 3 of them had to do with correlation between makerspace use and science, math, and ELA. One had to do with statistical interactions between demographics, usage, and academic growth. And then finally, about the interviews with staff members, what did they attribute student growth to based on their observations and experiences? My lit review, as I said earlier, there really was not that much literature out there as far as the quantitative part of makerspaces, especially in K-12 education. There was some about college education, which makes sense because those are people who are doing research. And there was also some out there about commercial makerspaces, which makes sense because very often part of the business model is just keeping data and analyzing it. But noticing that there were some common themes in here, just as far as the types of activities that were going on, the availability of things. But one that stood out was freshman engineering students at the University of Colorado. There was a significant retention within the engineering program for students who participated in early design experiences. So getting opportunities to go into a makerspace in their freshman year kept them in the program at a higher rate than students that took core classes their first year and didn't really start getting into making activities until their sophomore or junior years. And then looking at these last two, Benji Small et al., Welch and Wyatt Baxter, the importance of having a vision, a purpose for the space, developing the space around the community, and having a mission statement. I'll come back to that in a little bit. I looked at descriptives, ANOVAs, multiple regression analyses, and originally I thought that this was just going to be a solely quantitative study. And I was told that it was crazy to do a mixed method. But as I started to formulate a plan for looking at this data, I realized that interviewing people involved in the spaces was going to be really essential when trying to build a context for that data and just finding out what was actually going on and what makes each makerspace special and different and unique. So originally, I reached out to 19 or 20 school districts and received responses from about half of them. Then from that, had about 4 that were willing to work. One decided before we got started that they weren't going to be participating. And one decided after we started that they were not going to be participating because they did not want to, they misunderstood the data that they were going to be sharing as far as student assessments, which left me with 2 middle-class middle schools in New York State. That's just something you need to be prepared for. You will probably go into your study with really high hopes for what your response is going to be. And whether it's a survey or interviewees, that mortality rate is much higher than you can expect. But I did end up with 681 students. But unfortunately, even that 681 student sample size was fairly incomplete for other reasons. And the makerspace supervisors from each building were interviewed. I had planned to interview just one supervisor from each place, but in the middle of those interviews, teachers came in and they were just interested in talking about it and passionate about it. And I ended up interviewing about 8 people between the 2 buildings, most of whom were just spontaneous and then needed to fill out consent forms before we could continue speaking. The state assessments that I used, the 4th grade and 8th grade assessments, well, when I get to limitations, I'll talk a little bit more about this. But unfortunately, you'll notice here that although there's 3 tests in 4th grade, there's 5 tests in 8th grade. And depending on the track that students go on, they may end up in one of 2 different math classes and one of 2 different science classes. And that made it a little bit more difficult to compare data and compare between students. I created a Makerspace usage evaluation. It was essentially just a roster of all of the students, and people who were familiar with the space would identify if a student was a non-user, an infrequent user, or a frequent user. And then I also went and made observations of each Makerspace, took photos, looked at artifacts. So as far as findings go, it's heartbreaking when you start to analyze everything and you don't find the statistical significance in the areas that you were really hoping for, which was the case here. But there were some really interesting things that stood out. There were differences in Makerspace usage, definitely more users in school, what I identified as school B, that in school B, that Asian and Hispanic students were more likely to visit the Makerspace than in school C, and Black students in school B more likely than in school C. From here, I just wanted to point out number 3. General ed students who had used the Makerspace had scores above the Z-mean, non-users scored below the Z-mean. I ended up having to standardize, essentially Z out all of that data because of the different types of assessments. The 4th grade assessments were scored on a different scale than the 8th grade assessments. So this was necessary in order to look at growth and compare it between students and between the years. Another thing that got in the way was the number of opt-outs. The math test and the ELA test had such significant opt-outs that it made for really incomplete data for so many students, where I had their 4th grade data, but their 8th grade data just wasn't there for math or for ELA. In science, there was no significance based on demography, usage, and academic growth. In math, I'll come back to this in a little bit, but there were some interactions, statistically significant interactions between usage and socioeconomic status, and usage, race, school, and socioeconomic status. But like I said, I'll come back to that momentarily. Looking at assessment and growth in School B, the things that really stood out about this place, the building staff was not very involved in the makerspace, but the events and activities were highly publicized. The staff was there as resources. Some of them brought in materials for the makerspace. There were no assessments tied with the makerspace, and it was all student-directed projects. Meanwhile, in School C, all student-directed projects, but it was also an option for class projects. Teachers would tell the students that they could go to the makerspace if they wanted to complete something as a response to a prompt. And many students did take them up on it. It was a higher tech space for students to use during the lunch. Some students chose to go there instead of to outside for recess. Clubs and classes also used the space. So when looking at usage, this building made it much more accessible for students. There were so many more opportunities for students to get in there, whether all of those were voluntary or some of them were based on clubs or classwork, a little different. Teachers were involved in this room via duty periods, so there was also much more exposure of teachers to the makerspace, so they felt more comfortable making it an option for students. There was no direct evidence of growth, but different staff members noted all of those core classwork connections. More knowledgeable others, so important in the makerspaces. These people being used as resources and helping students, they were very hands-off until students either had questions for them or if they noticed that there was some sort of a safety issue. But other than that, they let students do their own investigating. The differences in usage percentages might be a result of policies, like I said on the previous slide, whether or not students could get in there easily on their own, if it was a scheduling thing. The effect of opt-out demographics, so important when it came time to analyze the data. Can't stress that one enough. Something that you might want to consider before you work on your project. And something else to consider that affected this was there was also changes in some of those state exams while the students were going through it. In a perfect world, this would be a longitudinal study where I could come up with an instrument that students would be exposed to before they went into, in this case, sixth grade, look at their measuring creativity, problem solving, etc., and then take something again as a post-assessment when they finished eighth grade. Unfortunately, I was using the data that was available to me and what they'd completed, and it did have some of its own limitations. That mortality rate with the opt-outs up to 66% depending on the exam. And also important to point out de facto scheduling. Some of the students didn't have lunch periods because they were taking extra classes or harder classes that had more periods, and therefore they couldn't be in the makerspace since they didn't have a free period. These may have also been some of the students who might be most interested in it, but just didn't have the accessibility to it. Definitely would love to study this a little bit more. It's unfortunate that the pandemic has almost stopped a lot of makerspaces, because the thought of just having a spot where students can go on an off period, not scheduled, interacting with each other, mixing, sharing ideas, but also sharing materials and in close spaces, makes it really difficult to do right now. But hopefully we can return to these soon. What's most important, or what's something I want to point out from all of the interviews, was how much the students enjoy the spaces. They love the freedom. They love being able to inquire. And with that, you hope that invested students, interested students will show up to school. And when they have something to look forward to, that might also increase attendance rates, which wasn't something that I had looked at. But I would wonder if that's something that could be investigated in a future study. Although I didn't find all the significances that I had hoped, and although my dissertation did have a lot of limitations that I wish I could have designed around, the experience was wonderful, and you guys are going to do a great job on all of these. And if you have any questions or you're looking for somebody who's recently been through it, feel free to reach out to me. Take care.